President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed into law 2 bills which the presidency says seeks to expand financial resources for the country's multi-party democracy. These are the Second Adjustments Appropriation Bill and the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill. The latter amends, among others, some of the provisions of the Political Party Funding Act as far as the issues, for example, of private and public funding of independent candidates and representatives, among others, is concerned. So Nkosikhulule Nyembezi, Election Monitoring Network Policy Analyst, joins us live now to talk about the significance of this particular moment. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Your reaction to the developments.
Thank you very much. It is worrying that the president went on to sign this legislation, particularly when there has been such a broad spectrum of opposition from inside and outside Parliament, particularly because we know that the legislation was initially intended to facilitate funding for independent candidates that will be contesting elections for the first time since the dawn of democracy. But in that process, there has been an insertion of other amendments that upsetted the formula and the proportionality of how large and small parties are going to be funded. And that has been done in favor of large parties, to the extent that civil society organizations and political parties in Parliament have raised their concern. One would have expected that the president would have taken all of that into account and not rushed to sign the law.
How much of a disadvantage then, in light of what you've said, does this put the smaller parties and independents in?
Firstly, practically, because it allows for large parties to get 90% of the available amount, of money that is allocated by the Electoral Commission to parties that manage to get seat in the legislative bodies, and then 10% to smaller parties. So that disadvantages smaller parties financially. And the other issue has to do with the issue of transparency. There's now lack of transparency in terms of private sources of private funding, to the extent that the threshold that existed was up to 100,000, from 100,000 upwards. You need to declare. 100,000 below, you don't need to declare. Now what we've seen is that this new law has now amended that to raise the threshold as well as the upper limit of how much each party can get. But in so doing, it leaves the power to the president to determine the amounts that constitute the threshold and the upper limit. And that gives too much power to the president to allow.
And I was going to say, this concentration then of power to one person, does it make sense, particularly when it comes to determining such contentious issues of funding?
Not at all. It does not make sense. We do know that what brought about the issue of Political Party Funding Act was to get that transparency, because we know that government issues tenders to private companies to do what we call service delivery. And in the process of doing so, a number of parties are favored, or they bid for those tenders by promising political parties that they would fund their campaign, by promising politicians that they would benefit from the process. We know all about it in terms of the Auditor General's reports, in terms of the commissions of inquiry that have been undertaken, that this corruption comes about because there is exchange of money and favors, because the state procures money from, services from private companies. Now, the absence of a systematic declaration of sources of funding, then it means that what we see political parties campaigning for and what we as voters end up voting on is going to be influenced by private money, people who bankroll these campaigns. So we don't want to see that. It actually reverses the milestones that have been achieved in the last 10, 15 years.
So looking at the parliamentary processes then, and some of the, the unhappiness that has been raised by some there, and the processes that are to unfold now, where does it put all of them?
I know that the political parties in Parliament, a number of them, the oppositions, have now announced that they are going to challenge this law in courts. It's going to take it's going to take longer to get a final determination on this, but at least they have declared their intention to challenge it in the courts of law. That is a good step to do because the process of amendment and passage of law allows for contestation in courts of law so that the courts can determine that whether the provisions are constitutional or not. But I think what is important for the South African public, the voters in particular, is to then see how the ANC in government is using its power on instances such as this and to vote accordingly in the coming elections. It makes sense when some of these things come out on the eve of the elections because the voters will then have an immediate opportunity to vote either in support by rewarding the ANC for doing this or to punish it by voting against the ANC or by voting differently in these elections. So it is democracy at work, and I think the elections will also help to determine whether indeed the South African public approves or disapproves of this.
And we'll see, of course, what also happens when it comes to those, legal challenges that are being threatened in this particular regard as well. But thank you so much for your analysis. Do appreciate it. That is Nkosikhulule Nyembezi, Election Monitoring Network Policy Analyst.